Okay, so how's everybody doing? I hope well. This is Monday morning, so good morning for 5 more minutes. I thought I would do hopefully a not too long session. This is an informational session, and I wanted just to present some ideas on theories of history and some ideas on philosophy real quick, just to give a little grounding and background. And I think some of this many of you would already know about, but there'll be a couple of surprises. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. Okay, so hope everyone can see this pretty well. So the theories of history, there are three dominant theories of history. The first one is cyclical, okay? So that history, in a sense, repeats itself, as in the cycles of a year. This was a dominant view of history in the ancient world, particularly from the Greeks, but probably true for the Persians, a lot of folks in the East, a lot of the civilizations in the East. And a lot of this was dependent upon the way they saw history, in the sense that years were counted in terms of the reigns of kings. So you would have these year one in the reign of Xerxes in Persia, let's say, or in Darius, until their death, and then they would start at year one again. But it also is a view of history that's tied to the cycles of the year, the cycle of the sun, winter, fall, spring, and summer. Obviously not in that order. And we still see this view of history come about a little bit. And it's the famous adage by Spinoza, right? That those that don't learn from history are forced to repeat it. So we see history repeat itself. People still do things that you would have thought we would know better of from history. Believe me, Hitler knew that what happened to Napoleon when Napoleon invaded Russia. But men and women are governed by their passions, by their vices, if you will. Hitler's avarice, his grandiosity, his pride, basically said, well, I know better than, I see what happened to Napoleon, and so I can overcome those things. He did not, thankfully. So that's the first notion. And I think, too, cyclical history, in a certain sense, is very much part of schooling, because we live as teachers, we live in students, we live a cyclical existence. One of the things that I like about being a teacher, being a professor particularly, is how every year, every semester, I have a new set of students I get to relearn who these folks are. You know, it's based novel challenges depending on who the students are, and that type of thing. So um, part of that, so that's tied in with the cyclical notion of history. The second notion, and the one I think is most familiar to us, it is certainly a dominant way of teaching history in school, is a progressive notion of history. That history is linear, and much like the way time operates. Um, the and so we move, history moves forward, and generally we think of it as life's getting better. Okay. I think we're being challenged with that currently. And I think most of the 21st century has been people wondering if things are actually getting better. And when they do, things happen like, pandemics, and things may not be getting better. This is actually not this is a dominant way of thinking for Western civilization, this kind of progressive notion, this linear notion of history. It's, life gets better. Things like indoor plumbing or material well-being, or even the notion of freedom, or we're becoming more free as history moves forward. This was certainly a belief of early Christians, part of the Roman Empire, who saw becoming Christian as helping with their affluency, helping their everyday lives. There was a social mobility tied to it, which, when Rome got sacked in the 5th century by the Goths, that kind of undermined that view, and led St. Augustine to write this City of God, his book, to basically point out that we live in God's time, which is ahistorical, right? There is no time and no history in God's view of the universe, and that we should take that view. Also, a progressive sense of history is tied into what has been called the Hegelian dialectic. Hegel believed that time marched forward through stages. Marx picked that up. He created his own historical dialectic, which basically argued that in the end, we will no longer need a state, because the workers, he saw the workers as the end of history, and that eventually the workers would create a utopia. We are looking at some of that at work even today. It was it was thought to be put to rest at the end of the Soviet Union with the capitalization of China, but that is no longer the case. So let me give you a quick idea of how one can disrupt this progressive notion. So think for a second. When did the 20th century begin? And here I'm thinking about social and political order. You might say in 1900, but I would suggest that the 20th century ended in June of 1914, when the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, we began the First World War. And by the end of that war, the old order, the order of empire, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, the German Empire, to some degree the French, and to some degree the British, had all been undermined, either had been undermined or had been overthrown. And so a new social order took place following the First World War. Okay. The orientation, the political orientation prior to the First World War was north-south, was a colonial orientation as understood by empire. After the First World War, after the end of the First World War, that orientation moved from north-south to east-west. With the rise of the Soviet Union and Russia, social revolutionary movements that most of them were put down in Eastern Europe, but they were there. They attempted to take control. You had the rise of social revolutionary movements in Asia, which the Soviets took advantage and brought back into their the Soviet Empire, all the old Tsarist in South and East Asia, those republics. So different types of orientation, east-west. So then the question is, when did the 20th century end? Obviously not in 2000. So it ended with either the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989, or a little bit later with the fall of the Soviet regime. And I would argue that the geopolitical orientation has, for the most part, been north-south, although that may be changing to some degree at present with the rising adversarial relationship with China, between China and the US. But if you think about the wars we fought in the Mideast, the things that have been going on in parts of Africa, so there's post-colonial conflicts. That orientation again is north-south, as it was in the 19th century. So that gives you some idea of a way of thinking about history in the sense of moving forward. We actually move back. Of course, one could argue the 21st century didn't begin in 2001. It began with the Netscape, the invention of Netscape, and everyday people having access to the internet. The internet has had the tendency to flatten out the world, and we see the ramifications of that, considering how much of our life we live online, whether it's for school or business, consumerism, for social interaction. So that, that kind of marks the 21st century at present. The final notion of history is what might be called the bouquet idea of history. And basically, the idea of the bouquet is that time. So in here, it would be associated stories about things fold back upon itself. So you can think of history as a bouquet of flowers, or even as a crumpled handkerchief. where you have these various intersections. Okay. So I'll lower this real quick. So I've sort of created this notion of a time machine. And so you see, we all recognize as a Coca-Cola can. So how is the Coca-Cola can a time machine? Well, think of the various technological, social stories that are tied to a Coca-Cola can, beginning with the opposable thumb and being able to cup our hands to hold a liquid. Okay, so we're talking about well into prehistory. And then the whole development of drinking containers and the various materials, pottery and bone and metal, you know, and how all of that worked to develop, you know, to technological development, that has brought us to where we are today. And we also can think of marketing, okay, around the Coke can, the whole notion of color and how we use color. It is no accident that Coca-Cola is red. Okay, I don't really know the reason, but it's a dominant color. It draws the eye. Okay, we have the story of new Coke and old Coke and classic Coke, and why did Coca-Cola change their recipe way back when? I guess it was the 80s. I can't remember. So in all the offshoots, you know, the cola business, this goes back to alchemy, patent medicines, the idea that Coca-Cola was developed as a kind of pick-me-up, a medicine to help the body. Of course, we all know it's called Coke because originally there was a trace amount of cocaine in Coke. It's also a cultural thing. It's a Southern thing. Coca-Cola developed in Georgia, and you know, went around the world. One of the biggest corporations. We could use other people, and it's a symbol of American culture, and has been used so in various movies and stuff. The whole idea of the jingle, you know, how, you know, the political aspects of commercials and Coke and, you know, these types of things. So there's all this history wrapped up in this single can. So that's why I call it a time machine. And that's a representation of kind of the bouquet notion of this unfolding of history, right? We come back. This bouquet notion of history is also tied to a concept called the eternal present, that in each moment, tied within itself, is all the past, the future. So each present moment has within itself the complete trajectory of past and present. Past and future. Okay. This notion of eternal present again goes back to St. Augustine in the City of God, and that you know, God does not live in time, does not exist in time, and that as Augustine, as good Christians, we should not live in time either. We shouldn't be concerned with the outcomes because God's in control. That's that notion, and that's part of this notion of eternal present. I also like to say that the eternal present, we enter into the eternal present in our everyday lives when we were children, we began to play, and you know, we were then suddenly told that it was time to go home, and that we thought, well, we've only been playing for a few minutes, but we've been playing for hours. So when you lose, so those moments in our lives when we lose track of time, you enter into eternal present. And I would enter into this a lot when I wrote my dissertation, sitting in a coffee shop, and I would lose track of time working on a passage, if you will. And so, various ways that this can occur, and everybody's familiar. So we often think of history as the same thing as time, and our notions of time will vary. Our notions of history, as we've just seen, cyclical, linear, time marches forward, or the bouquet, the unfolding of time, through events and through materials. So they're not necessarily the same thing. I like to ask, what is a historical fact? And that is very much tied into the notion of a fact. Historical fact is nothing more than a statement about the past, which we understood to be the past. But that statement about the past is always made present. So the present impacts the past and how we see it and understand it. This is part of, we're going through some of this right now with the statutes issues. When we're judging, should we judge individuals from the past based on our current understanding? I can understand both those arguments. So this comes back to what, I said is a statement about the past. So what is a fact? So a fact, and I don't mean to disrupt the fact opinion lesson that you might be teaching in a science class or an English class or history class. But according to Wittgenstein, if you read his philosophical works, a fact is nothing more than a statement about the world. Okay, what you often present as fact in that fact opinion dichotomy is really a scientific fact. So it's a fact that is provable. Okay, otherwise it's opinion. But you can have facts as statements about the world that are true. My wife loves me is a true fact, but empirically, there's no way I can prove that point. Because I, as a cynic, as a radical cynic, I can come up with an excuse for any proof that you might want to raise about the fact that my wife loves me or that I love my wife. And there are facts that are sometimes true and then sometimes false. This becomes clear as you study molecular physics, where something exists because you look at it. Also, you have the example of Pluto. It was a fact at one time that Pluto was a planet. It is now a fact that it's no longer a planet, or maybe they changed it. I don't know. So a fact can be true and then false. Okay. And then you can have false facts as well. So these are just different ways to think about history and philosophy. And so the notion of a fact is a philosophical, I'm dealing with it from a philosophical perspective. So philosophy real quick. And these are three main areas of philosophy. I kept trying, I should have looked on Wikipedia because I don't think there may be, I don't know. So moral philosophy deals with the good. So we are only dealing with that tangentially in the Moral Life at Schools book. I think most of what we're dealing with in that book will come under the next category, which is axiology. Okay, so moral philosophy is about the good. Axiology is about value. And the two areas of value of axiology are aesthetics and ethics. And so with Moral Life of Schools, we'll be dealing more with ethics. Okay. And so axiology deals with the beautiful. And I would argue that one of the things you'll be looking for, an ethical teaching practice will also be a good or beautiful teaching practice. There will be an aesthetic tied to that. Okay. And so it is good because it is beautiful. Okay. So there's, from the ancient Greeks, we get this relationship of the good and the beautiful. Okay. The one area that as teachers and educators we deal with the most is logic or dialectic. And we'll be reading a little bit about the art of dialectic. There'll be a few things around this, around some of these philosophies, all three of these in Plutarch. But certainly as we get into the next two readings, logic or dialectic, they're the same thing, will come into play. They're dealing with right thinking, proper argument, or you could also think proper presentation. When you do a lesson plan, you're creating a dialectical map, right, that leads you through your teaching arguments. Okay, what you're trying to teach is you essentially, as you teach, you're engaging in a kind of argument, a rhetorical argument, a presentation. You're trying to present knowledge in a particular kind of way. You want students to have an outcome. This is the role of method. Method is very much tied to dialectic, and we'll be talking about that in the second article, the art of the question method. Okay, so there is a body of evidence coming out of the Middle Ages that talks about teaching dialectic. We don't talk about it that way anymore. We talk about it as lesson plans, and we've psychologized that. We no longer deal with it from a philosophical point of view. That's been overtaken by psychologies, be it behaviorism or in their methodologies, or cognitivism and their methodologies. Okay. But essentially what we're doing is, when we teach, is we're doing philosophy. So that's why I said to teach is to do philosophy. We don't think about it from a philosophical point of view, which would be, I didn't write it down, a concept called theoria. We're engaged in a kind of teaching praxis, not to be confused with the test. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about question method. Okay. But everything that we do philosophically as a teacher is tied to what I would call the practical, because there's a point that we're trying to get to in terms of. Okay. I hope you enjoyed this. It's I thought I might do this before we get started with too much of the reading, so that you have some background, and maybe you'll see some of these things arise in the readings that you do. Certainly it will, in terms of the Moral Life of Schools. You might get you'll certainly get a sense of progressive history in the Kleebard book, Struggle for the American Curriculum. Um, you may see a bit of the bouquet notion uh, of, of history in the following. So anyway, so all the best, and there'll be more coming at the end of this week, next week, in terms of videos. Bye.